Good morning. Welcome to our next installment of recorded webinars for the historic and environmental review processes here at IHCDA. Today we will be going over the certificate of approval process in partnership with DHPA. I'm Carmen Leffig. I'm the placemaking manager at the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. I also oversee the historic and environmental review processes for our federal funds from HUD and our state development fund.
I'm Ashley Thomas. I am the Historic Architecture Specialist for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, which also functions as the Indiana State Historic Preservation Office for Indiana.
So the goal for this training today is to explain when a certificate of approval is required. We will provide an overview of the application for a certificate of approval form, and we'll also explain the timeline for the impacts of this review process. So I wanted to go over some of the review processes here at IHCDA's Real Estate Department. And how some of the different reviews impact your timeline as far as the review process standpoint. So when you apply for development funds, you might be doing that as a standalone application, which is at the bottom of this chart, or you might be doing it in conjunction with a low-income housing tax credit application, also known as LIHTC. As gap funding. So the LIHTC has no inherent historic review or environmental review process, but if you are requesting development fund or you're requesting home funds, those will trigger separate historic review process during the application review process. So just a little bit about the Development Fund Historic Review. Projects that receive IHCDA Development Fund are statutorily required to undergo a historic review process prior to loaning or granting the development funds. For the purpose of this training, a certificate of approval would be triggered by the use of those development funds from IHCDA on a project with a building that is either a building that is listed on the state or national register, or a building or a site that's in a district that is listed on the state or national register. Ashley will go over what these things mean in detail later on in the presentation. So another part of the process is when you have an applicant, or the applicant will provide documentation that shows that the building or site meets either requirement listed on the previous slide. You'll do that at the time of application. IHCDA will review the information submitted during the application review process. So for example, if you have submitted a development fund application, then in conjunction with a LIHTC application, I will be reviewing your submitted historic review items during that July to November timeframe. If you're funded, then IHCDA will submit on your behalf a certificate of approval to DHPA if you fall within those parameters. That second bullet point on this slide is the information to submit upon the development fund application. Again, either a standalone application or a LIHTC application with a development fund gap financing. So if you'll skip down to that last bullet point, everything that I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes can be found in very detailed steps in the IHCDA Environmental Review User's Guide in Appendix 3. I have step-by-step on how to create all of the different documentation that I need, and also Ashley will be going over all of this in detail as what is required for supporting documentation for the certificate of approval. But basically what we need is color maps identifying the project site. So you can go onto Google Earth and get an aerial view of the project. We want to see where the building or the site is in relation to other uses around it, pictures of the building or site and the surrounding area. We need a map identifying the project from DNR DHPA's Indiana Historic Buildings, Bridges, and Cemeteries map. And if you have applied for or you're anticipating applying for federal historic tax credits, please submit any information that you have either submitted or you're going to submit up until whatever you have at this point. That way it helps me submit the information to DHPA.
All right, so the need for certificate of approval comes from Indiana Code 1421.1, which states that a historic site or structure owned by the state or historic site or structure listed on the National Register may not be altered, demolished, or removed by a project funded in whole or in part by the state, unless the review board has granted a certificate of approval. For the purpose of this training, as Carmen mentioned, a certificate of approval may be triggered by the use of development funds if there is a historic property on the site. If a project involves demolition of a listed structure or significant alteration of character-defining features of a historic structure, then a certificate of approval will have to go to the Historic Preservation Review Board, which meets quarterly, January, April, July, and October each year. So a schedule of the upcoming board meetings can be found on the DHPA website, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. There are two agencies involved in this process. HCDA is the administrator of the development fund, so Carmen helps out, and then also the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology reviews certificate of approval applications. So you will be working with both of us to get through the process. The application form is available on the DHPA website. Carmen also has a copy of it as well, so if you need that, you can talk to her. The form was revised in August of 2019, so if you have a previous version of the form, please make sure that you get rid of that and start using the new version. We will be using the new version in this presentation, so you'll kind of see what those changes are. Most of the changes involve formatting and clarification of questions, and overall the information that has to be provided by the applicant remains substantially the same as it did previously. All forms and additional information must be submitted to DHPA in hard copy. As Carmen stated earlier, she will be filling out the form for the development fund, but we're going through the application step by step just to make sure that as an applicant you are aware of the type of information that is asked for so that you understand why you have to provide it to her. So at the top of the form, this is a new addition, so if you familiar with the old version of the form, this will be the only big difference. We added a area that has a request for the date because that wasn't on there previously, and then also there's a series of checkboxes. These checkboxes are very important because it allows us to understand what review processes you will be going through for your project, as many of the projects that go through HCDA use multiple funding sources. This helps us to streamline the review process by making sure that we're connecting all the dots on our end. If you are doing a submission for something that has never come into our office before for any reviews, then you would click the new submittal box. If it is something that we are reviewing for federal historic tax credits, or if you're going to be undergoing a 106 review because you're getting some kind of home funds, then you would mark the appropriate boxes for those. And also, if it went through a previous 106 review, like if you did the home fund review first and then you decided to do development funds or whatever, any response letter you have from our office will have a DHPA number on the letter. You need to make sure that you include the DHPA number in the blank on this page. That allows us to connect the projects in our system and make sure that we have a single reviewer working on it, and also that all the projects are linked, so going forward, updates to the scope of work will be much simpler. Item number 1 is basically, why are we doing a certificate of approval review? So for the purpose of this training, that information would just be you're getting funds from HCDA through the development fund. Item number 2 deals with who to contact for the project. Who should we ask questions of? Who do we need to send the response to? Item number 3 is about the location of the project. So we need an address, or if for some reason you don't have a street address, as much information as you can provide to help us find the project. We have to map all projects that come in for review, so the more information you can provide, the better. Item number 4 is about the scope of work. So we need to know as much detail as possible about what is being done as part of this project. If there are items that you have not finalized yet, so for example, if you're doing replacement windows but you don't know what the new replacement windows will be, then just state that here so that we understand that that information is not available yet and will be provided once it is available. Item number 5 is about impacts on buildings, not necessarily just the building or the site that you're working on, but also the surrounding properties. So especially if you're doing work in a historic district, this is very important. You need to look at not just the impacts you're having on the site that you're working on, but also potential impacts, both physical impacts and visual impacts on surrounding resources. So if you're building a new building on a vacant lot in a historic district, if you're putting an addition on a historic building that could have large visual impacts on the surrounding properties, that all needs to be considered in addition to the work you're actually doing to the project site. Item number 6 is basically the archaeology question. We're wanting to know what were previous ground disturbances on this project area, and then also what kind of ground disturbance is going to take place as part of this project. This allows us to determine if our archaeologists need to even look at the project. If there's no ground disturbance, then it doesn't have to get an archaeological review through our office, which may help speed up your review process a little bit because it's only one reviewer having to look at it rather than 2. Ground disturbance is considered to be any movement of the ground. So whether you're regrading for landscaping, if you are redoing a driveway or a sidewalk, if you're pouring a new foundation, all of that would fall into this category. Item number 7 is about the history of the site. So we want to know about the building, if there's a historic building on the property, when was it constructed, what major alterations have taken place over time, was it heavily remodeled in the 1970s, so there's no remaining historic material, that kind of thing. Were there buildings on the site prior to this one? What kind of ground disturbance has taken place here? Like if you know historically that there was another building on the site, then we would need to know about that. So this is about the history of the site and the buildings on it. There is information through our SHAARD database. If you aren't aware of the date of construction of your building or anything like that, it's a good resource to start with. The SHAARD database, SHAARD stands for State Historic Architecture and Archaeological Research Database. We call it SHAARD because it's a lot easier to say. It includes digital versions of the Indiana Historic Sites and Structures Inventory, which were formerly published in the form of county interim reports. So if you're familiar with the hard copy books of the county interim reports, it's the same information. It also includes data sets such as National Register listings in Indiana, historic bridges, cemeteries, and archaeological sites. The archaeological sites are only accessible by qualified archaeologists, though. So if you're a qualified archaeologist, then you need to make sure you get approval to access those sites. So along with SHAARD, we also have the Indiana Historic Buildings, Bridges, and Cemeteries map, or the IHBBC. This is the GIS mapping component of SHAARD. It allows users to search for their project area, and then once you find your project area, you can access all the databases or data sets from SHAARD directly from the map. This allows you to quickly determine if your property is listed in or potentially eligible for the National Register. So this is a screenshot from the IHBBC. You can see this is Mass Ave in Indianapolis, if that helps you orient yourself if you're familiar with the area, but you can see on the map that there is an outline of the Mass Ave Historic District, which is the hatched area. So any hatched areas with blue outlines are National Register listed districts. And then there is also a star symbol on the map. Those are individually listed properties on the National Register. And then the colored dots are information from the county survey. So for the purpose of certificate of approvals, we're concerned with properties that are listed in the state or national registers. So you're going to be looking for your project site and then looking to see if there's either a star or if it's within a hatched area. And this is the map that Carmen really wants to see when you submit the information to her. There is a way to print a map from here into a PDF that you can then print out and attach to your submission to Carmen. and all of the information on how to do that is on our website. In order to find your property on the map, it works just like searching Google Maps. There's a text box up in the upper left-hand corner. You just type in the address, hit enter, and it will pan to that address, and then you can zoom in.
I do also want to mention that all of this information, the links to this website and how to make the map are in the Appendix 3 that I mentioned earlier in this webinar.
So to access the map and SHAARD, you go to our website, which is www.in.gov/DNR/historic. This is what our website currently looks like. You can see the link to SHAARD is outlined in the yellow box. Occasionally they will redesign our website, so even if it doesn't look like this, the link to SHAARD will always be on our homepage. So it may be in a different location, but it will always be on the main landing page of our website. Once you click on it, it will take you to a page similar to this. It includes links to access both the SHAARD database and IHBBC map, along with user guides for both systems. So if you need to figure out how to do something in the map, this is a good place to check. If you can't figure it out from the user guide, then you can contact the HPA and we'll be happy to kind of help you figure out what's going on and help you find your project area. I'm going to quickly go over kind of the benefits of why we created SHAARD and IHBBC. Everything's available online and it can be accessed from any device. It works even on your phone. So if you're on site and you want to look up and see what's in your area, what you need to take photographs of, that kind of thing, you can access the map on your phone. Like I said, we provide user guides for how to use it. We're also currently working on a webinar, so we're hoping that that will be out sometime later in 2019 on how to use the IHBBC map and all the different functions. So watch for that on our website. As counties are resurveyed through the county survey system, the data is uploaded as soon as a township is completely surveyed. And so the information in IHBBC and SHAARD is constantly being updated, so you get the information a lot faster than you used to when we did paper copies. All 92 counties in Indiana have been surveyed, and some have been done multiple times. The digital format also allows us at DHPA to easily update information that's incorrect or outdated. So while you're working on your project and doing the map for Carmen, if you find an error, if something's wrong, please let us know so that we can fix it so that it'll be right going forward. Typically, this has to deal with buildings being demolished and us not being aware of it. So if you find something like that, please let us know. Also, important to note, because the new surveys are being done digitally and uploaded directly into SHAARD, and because we're correcting issues when we find problems, it's very important that you use SHAARD and the IHBBC instead of using the hard copies of the interim reports. The only exception to that is Marion County. If you are doing work in Indianapolis and Marion County, you will have to use the hard copy of the interim reports at this point because of the number of sites in Marion County and the date of the survey. It's so outdated that it's not worth the time it would take to input all of the thousands and thousands of sites into the SHAARD database. So we are waiting to do Marion County until we can resurvey it. So if you are doing work in Marion County, you will have to use the books. Other than that, you should be using the online resources instead. The National Register sites are in for Marion County, though, so if you're just trying to figure out if your building's listed or not, you can use the online map for that. Okay, so items number 8 through 11 on the form all have to do with the information that needs to be attached to the packet when you submit it, or the information that you need to send to Carmen so that she can attach it. Number 8 just deals with a map. Like Carmen said earlier, we need a good map. Aerial maps from Google are great. We need to make sure that the streets are labeled. If possible, if there's a north arrow, that's super helpful. Basically, we need to just know where your project is. Like I mentioned earlier, we have to map all the projects that come in for review. So the better the map, the quicker we can map it and move on with our review. Item number 9 deals with photographs. You need to include photographs of your project area as well as the surrounding area of potential effects. Like I said before, we're looking at not just the impacts to the site you're working on, but also the surrounding historic properties. So please make sure you provide current photographs of both the project area and the area around it. You need to be able to see the building site or feature. Please make sure that there's not like a giant tree or something in front of the building that you're taking the picture of. It makes it hard to review that way. The current photos must be in color. Black and white do not provide enough information. They need to be labeled or keyed to a site plan or a map, or floor plans if you have interior photographs. You can provide more than one resource of photo if you need to, and maximum of 2 photos per page. If you put many more than 2, it becomes too small and we can't see the details that we need to see. If you have a project with a huge number of photographs and you don't want to print them all out, you can put more than 2 photos per page if you also provide a digital copy of the images. Also, please do not just send in images from online resources. This is an example where if you only used online resources, it would be providing incorrect information. So this image was taken in June of 2011 on Google Street View. I reviewed this building for demolition in April of 2012. The building was demolished later that same year, but up until September of 2017, that image of the building was still the same one from 2011. So if you hadn't gone out to the site and taken photos yourself, you would have assumed that building was still there when it had actually been demolished 5 years prior. So it's very important that you go out and check the site yourself, take the photographs yourself, get good current representation of the conditions. And this applies not only for resources like Google, but also even for the SHAARD database. So this image was from our SHAARD record. It was for a National Register listed property, and we've been trying to update all of the older photographs and get current color ones of everything. And so I was given this photo and told to go find this house out in the country. And when I looked at the picture, I just assumed that that building was going to be gone based on the condition in the photograph and the fact that this photo was probably from the mid-'80s. So assuming that nobody had done anything, it was probably not there anymore. I really didn't think I would find it. But then when I found it, somebody had fully restored the house. So even with SHAARD, it's very important that you go out and do the photos yourself, because conditions can change on a property over time, and even in a very short period of time, conditions can change. So it's very important that the photographs provided are current and accurate of the existing conditions. If you have a really large project area, or if you're doing a project on a site in a historic district, large streetscape photos are really, really helpful because it gives us a really good idea of the context around the building, and it makes it easier to evaluate potential impacts. So rather than doing photographs of every single individual building around it, it's a lot better actually to just do the streetscape photographs because it provides us more information. So questions 10 and 11 on the application deal with site plans and drawings. All site plans and floor plans need to have north arrows. The text needs to be large enough to read. If you need to, especially on site plans, provide keys for the different line types and hatching. Not all firms use the same key for their line types, and so if we don't have a key of what we're looking at, we don't really understand the information. Also, if you're going to scale down the drawings and you think that they might be hard to read, please also provide a PDF copy of the drawings. And another thing to note is that architectural drawings aren't always required. So depending on your project, you may not have to submit drawings. If it's more just maintenance and updating existing features like doing repairs, you may not have to have architectural drawings. So if you're not sure if you need the drawings or not, then just ask us and we will tell you if we think they need to be provided. Item number 12 deals with projects where you know that what you're doing may be an adverse impact or may alter historic characters of the building, or if you're demolishing a building. This is kind of where you need to explain or provide Carmen the information that explains why you're making the decisions you're making. So for example, if you're proposing to demolish a historic building in a listed district, if it's because of structural issues, make sure you explain that. And also, if you have a structural report from an engineer saying that there's no way to stabilize the building, provide a copy of that, because then we don't have to ask the question. The same thing would go for replacement of historic materials. So if you have historic windows, like historic wood windows that are beyond repair, like they cannot be fixed, then you need to provide an explanation here, as well as providing photographs of the existing conditions of the window justifying replacement, and then also information on the proposed replacement windows. Like, what are you putting back into place? What will they fit the existing opening fully? Will it match the configuration of the historic windows? Especially with windows, if you have the specs for the windows you're proposing to put in particularly measurements of the different portions, like different parts of the window, that's very important to make sure that what you're putting in is compatible. So if you have anything like that and you're not sure what information needs to be provided for that specific item, please just ask us and we can tell you ahead of time so that when you submit the information, we can make sure that everything is there. And then item number 13 is basically just a question about how long is your project going to take. The typical certificate of approval is valid for 2 years from the date that it is issued. So unless it is indicated in this box that it's going to take longer than 2 years for the project, we'll just assume it's a 2-year period. If you're going to do a project that's going to take 3 or 5 years, make sure that you indicate that so that we can add something in the approval letter stating how long it's valid so you don't end up having to come back for another certificate of approval. I'm going to really quickly go over the Secretary of the Interior standards. These are the standards that our office uses to review all projects. So whether you're going to the Federal Historic Tax Credit Program, a Section 106 review, or the Certificate of Approval process, we use the same standards for all of them. So these are a very good resource that you should familiarize yourself if you're going to be doing work on historic buildings. They are available on the National Park Service website. There are 4 different treatment methods within the standards, but we typically use rehabilitation for any kind of project where you're reusing an existing building. So those are the standards you probably need to look at. Within the standards document, there are also the guidelines for the treatment of historic properties. They expand upon the standards and for each kind of treatment method and material in a building, and they kind of provide recommended and not recommended treatments. So there's 2 columns in the standards for recommended and not recommended. As long as all of your work is falling within the recommended category, then your project meets the standards and there should be no concerns with getting it approved. If you're doing anything in the not recommended category, that's when you're going to get into your adverse impacts and look at having to do more work as far as mitigation and that kind of thing. So if possible, keep all of your work in the recommended category. If you're getting into the not recommended category, then that's when you kind of need to provide that justification of why are you doing what you're doing and kind of explain the reason behind it. Once we review the project and compare it to the standards, we'll determine what kind of impact it's going to have on the historic resource. If it's determined that the project will not significantly alter the characteristics that make the property eligible for the National Register and will not impact archaeological resources, then the review will likely result in a clearance letter from the DHPA staff without having to go to the board. If it's determined that the project will significantly alter the characteristics that make a property eligible or will impact archaeological resources, then it will be sent to the Historic Preservation Review Board for their approval. And as I mentioned earlier, the board meets 4 times a year, January, April, July, and October. They usually meet about mid-month. The specific dates for the meetings are posted on the DHPA website. If you are aware that your project will have to go to the board, the certificate of approval application has to be submitted in hard copy to the DHPA at least 40 days before the board meeting to get on that agenda. So if you don't get it in 40 days before the January meeting, then when it comes in, it would get bumped to the April meeting. So this can greatly impact your timeline. So it's very important if you think that you're doing something that's going to go against the standards and is going to result in an adverse effect, especially if you're looking at demolishing a historic resource, make sure that you work with Carmen ahead of time and let her know that so that she can make sure that the application gets to us in time to get on the board meeting that you need it on for your timeline. Also, if something is going to the board meeting, please be prepared to have someone from your project at the board meeting to answer questions if the board members have them. Overall review timelines, basically anything that comes to the SHPO office, including the certificate of approval application, we have 30 days to review. But the difference is with the certificate of approval, like I just mentioned, there's that 40-day requirement for the board meeting. So if you're going to have to go to the board, it will be over 40 days in our office because you have to meet that 40-day requirement, and then we won't issue any kind of official approval or anything until after the board meeting, within a couple days after the board meeting. So make sure you plan ahead for that in your timeline. And it's also important to note that the 30-day timeline, it starts every time something's submitted. So if we have to ask you for additional information and it comes back in, that starts a new 30-day clock. So keep that in mind as well.
And the reason why this slide is on here is so that you can prepare ahead of time for your project and when you can start construction. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, you will not be allowed to close on your development fund loan or your home loan until all of this process is completed. The certificate of approval review will happen after the board meeting, which happens after your application has been reviewed. So for example, with the LIHTC program, your application is being reviewed from July till November. Sometime in November and December, I look at all of the projects that are receiving development fund and see whether or not a certificate of approval is required. If a certificate of approval is required, then I will start working on that paperwork and send it to SHPO. During that time, if it looks like you'll have to go to the Historic Review Board, I will be speaking with you on adjusting your expectations for your project in order for you to understand when how your project will be impacted in the long run as far as construction and lease up and the other LIHTC requirements that are required for your investors and for your construction timeline. And with that, thank you for attending. I recommend that you pay attention to the IHCDA red notices and IHCDA's website for the additional trainings that we have recorded and will be recording in the next couple of weeks. We will provide additional information through those communications. That is it for us. Thank you for attending and for listening to this training. And then if you have any questions, we are always available to talk to you about your project. Thank you.